Good evening. My name is Danielle Hodes, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs here at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's program, along with those tuning in to our live web broadcast at 911memorial.org/live. And as always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members in the audience. And tonight we're joined by Isobel Yeung, an award-winning correspondent working across Vice News Tonight and the Emmy Award-winning half-hour nightly newscast and the multi-award-winning Vice on HBO documentary series. Isobel joined Vice in 2014 after working in China for 4 years, where she reported and developed shows for several Asian and UK TV channels, and wrote for notable publications including The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Independent, and South China Morning Post. Isobel has covered a wide range of global stories at Vice, including recent coverage of the aftermath in the fragile Philippine community where ISIS laid siege, the crippling state of Assad-controlled Syria, and the Islamic State's impact on Iraqi youth. And she has been nominated for an Emmy Award and has won a Gracie and Front Page Award for elevating the plight of Afghan women's rights struggles. Before we dive in, please be advised that due to the nature of tonight's program, some potentially disturbing media will be displayed as part of the discussion. We're particularly thrilled to have Isobel with us, as we've been following her work for several years. And we're also deeply grateful to Vice for their continued collaboration on our public programs. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Isobel Yeung in conversation with 9/11 Memorial Museum Director of Public Programs, Jessica Chen.
Isobel, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
As Danny mentioned, we've been following your work and the work of your colleagues at Vice for many years now. And what we appreciate about Vice's reporting is that not only does it give us a bit of policy perspective, but we really get to see the humans and the real people being affected by some of these issues. So our conversation tonight is really going to focus on Syria, as covered in the episode of Vice on HBO, After the Fall, Syria After ISIS, and also looking at Women in War, which was a segment that focused on women in Yemen and how that situation has affected them. But I'm also hoping in the course of our conversation we can talk a little bit more about your experience reporting from the front line and kind of the impact that's had on you overall as a journalist. So first, to kind of set up our conversation on Syria, before we kind of dive into some of the great visuals and narrative that Vice has set up for us, I kind of wanted to get a sense of, where did this story begin for you? And did you have a sense of the people or the communities, the narratives that you might want to capture when you arrived?
Yeah, so this was a story, I don't know who's seen this or not, but this was a story where we go into Raqqa in northern Syria. And at this point, it was several months after the fall of Raqqa from ISIS-held territory. And so we really just wanted to go in there and tell a very human story about what it's like to try and pick up your lives and rebuild what's left of your life when 80% of the city has been completely destroyed, and kind of what remnants of your life exist after that. So yeah, I mean, we had a sense of what was going on there. We had a sense of kind of what types of people we wanted to talk to, but a lot of it was on the ground reporting in terms of trying to figure that out when we were there.
Sure. Let's go ahead and turn to our first clip to see what Isobel's talking about.
But last June, the battle to retake Raqqa from ISIS began. Led by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, and supported by airstrikes from a US-led military coalition.
It wasn't a visual trip. It was more of a...
Looks like we're having a little delay on the clip over here. Maybe give them 30 seconds. Maybe let's just go into one of the stories and see if we can kind of give you that aerial visual sense of kind of the bigger picture. But 80% of Raqqa is destroyed. Communities are coming in to literally rebuild their physical homes or try to reoccupy homes that have been destroyed. But we also see kind of the the emotional process in which families are trying to connect with those who are missing, those who are presumed to be dead. You know, I'm kind of curious, particularly, and let's see if we can set up another clip. There is a scene in which you know, you're looking at a man who's actually dealing with the challenges of the physical landscape there. Many of these homes have been left booby-trapped by mines by ISIS, and so they're looking, you know, for how to kind of reoccupy those homes. And you know, I'm kind of curious, and this helps us set up the clip. You know, who ended up going into these places to render them hospitable?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we knew going in there was the fact that there really isn't the international aid and the support. Are we going to play it?
Oh, no.
Okay, so there really wasn't the international support that the city needed. I mean, according to the city mayor, they needed $5 billion to attempt to rebuild the city, and they were getting a small fraction of that. And one of the things that's striking about a city like Raqqa is the level of human resilience there. There are so many people who have returned. I think so far about 150,000 people have returned to the city to just pick up their lives and attempt to rebuild what's left of them, which is pretty remarkable given that a lot of what's left of the city is just pure rubble and destruction. And there are still hundreds of dead bodies lying around the city that are yet to be dug up, that have yet to be identified. The city is yet to really be rebuilt. I mean, rubble has been cleared from a lot of the main roads, but there's still like a huge level of destruction after 4 months of obliteration. And so really what was happening is we found that a lot of locals were just trying to clear homes. The man that I think that we're going to play the clip of is a volunteer who, you know, wanted to help people pick up their lives again and felt very passionately about that there wasn't the international support or the help that the city needed. And so he volunteered to just go into these houses that have been booby-trapped by ISIS fighters as they were fleeing, and just to clear them. And this guy has very little training in terms of how to actually go about demining something, but they're kind of left with very little choice. And so this was kind of, there were a lot of people around the city who were just doing this on a ad hoc basis.
Sure, and just to, and by way of also allowing a little bit more time for our video technicians, you know, something that struck me as I watched this clip, which we will hopefully all see, was just that, you know, here's a man who's taking on what appears to me to be an extremely technical task. You know, how did you get a sense of how people learn those skills?
So I think this particular man had actually at some point worked for a international organization that was there and that was like training people to an extent. And at the time we went there, the US had actually pulled out about $200 million towards that effort of rebuilding and stabilizing the city. And so some people, he'd got some skills, a limited amount of international training from that before the program itself was pulled. So he kind of picked up bits and pieces from that and applied them for himself. But I mean, this is the kind of task that you go in there with teams of people, and you have, you know, people backing you up, etc., and you have a kind of somewhat of an escape plan, and you have an equipment. And this guy was in his tracksuit trousers and his sorry, you don't use that phrase in America. He was in his joggers, and he was in his sneakers, and he was just going in there and winging it, basically.
Not to give away any more details about the clip.
I just gave it all away. Sorry.
No, and really to understand, it's really quite a remarkable feat that this man undertakes.
دي لقيت واحد ايه واحد خليه يمشي وراي عداس وين احط رجلي احط رجله ايوه اوكي اول شيء افك الساعة وبعدين افصلوا عنا البطارية خلاص ما يظلوا اللزوم خالص بس خلص هي هاي وهذيك الورانية هي اللي طلعت.
My palms are sweaty. How are you not scared? My heart was going like this the whole time you were up there.
ما شعوري عادي كان ميت عملنا اللي شفته اللي شلت الأطفال وشفت العالم الميتين وشلتهم يعني كل ما أشيل طفل كل ما أشيل رجل كل ما أشيل كذا قلبي ما عاد أتحمل.
I think, just also something that comes across to me in the clip is that, he's literally using an iPhone as a flashlight trying to...
Yeah, that was my iPhone, actually. I was like, please come back with this.
What strikes me is, we're all waiting, watching this with bated breath, wondering what's going to happen. And when he comes out of the house, he's quite, it's almost like the atrocities that he's already seen have made this seem like almost something natural that he would be doing.
Yeah, he was cool as a cucumber. It's really remarkable. I mean, everything's just so relative. And I feel like given what these people have seen for the last few years living under ISIS rule, given that, I mean, when we were there every day, there were still casualties and fatalities coming into the hospitals because children or civilians were stepping on mines. So, I mean, given what he's seen, there is this, like, as he said, kind of numbness that kind of was just really disturbing, really hard to grasp. And I should also say that, I mean, a couple of weeks after we filmed with him, my producer, Jackie, who's here tonight, and I sadly received photos from our fixer of this man who had sadly passed away as he was demining another house and leaving behind his wife and 3 children. And it's, it really actually hit home how incredibly fragile his life and so many other people's lives are there, and the remarkable work that he's doing.
And just to give a sense of the scale, I mean, this was just one home, one mine among a city that was completely destroyed. So with hope, I am turning back to the first clip that will give you a sense of the city at large.
But last June, the battle to retake Raqqa from ISIS began. Led by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, and supported by airstrikes from a US-led military coalition. For 4 months, missiles rained on Raqqa, eventually driving out and defeating the caliphate. The SDF took control of the city. But it was a brutal victory that left 80% of the city uninhabitable. This is the center of the city where you can see just enormous levels of destruction. I mean, almost every single building is crumbled and falling in on itself. At the same time, you can see people starting to move back. I mean, some of these shops have already opened pretty optimistically, and people are starting to rebuild their lives.
mean, with that clip, we really get a sense of kind of the scale of destruction, but also the fact that these homes aren't inhabitable. And you did meet many people who had either rented homes across from their original home because they couldn't move back. And you asked them kind of what, who they blamed. And I think I want to quote one young man, Talib, who was a resident in Raqqa during the occupation and came back afterwards. And he says, Bashar al-Assad's regime destroyed us. The Syrian army destroyed us. The SDF destroyed us. ISIS destroyed us. Al-Nusra Front destroyed us. Airstrikes destroyed us. Russia destroyed us. Iran destroyed us. The coalition destroyed us. They all came to Syria and destroyed it. Can you talk to me a little bit about that sentiment and the impression that people had of what had brought this destruction onto their homes?
Yeah, it was a real mixed bag. I mean, I think that quote is pretty accurate. I mean, they really did feel like they were getting it from all angles. I mean, they've lived under brutal Assad regime, then they lived under this horrific ISIS regime in which terrible human rights atrocities were committed, and then their city was obliterated by the coalition, and now they're just living in this ghost city. And so, yeah, I think that it depends who you talk to, actually, because some people on the ground blamed sort of one side more than the other. Some people wished that Assad, we heard it all, we heard that some people wished that the Assad government would come back and kind of control that area. There was hopes that some people were, I wouldn't say happy, but were glad that the Kurds had some control there. Some people said that, life was better under ISIS. Yes, it sucked, but at least we could afford to eat bread. And so, yeah, but overall, I would say that there was this overriding feeling of all international forces have only made things worse for these people.
And you touched a little bit on this in relation to the demining situation in the house, but was there a presence of aid agencies, even if they weren't kind of participating in rendering safe some of these homes? Where were they in this? Because all we see are the people who are trying to make do with what they have. Yeah,
there were some. I mean, there was sort of a limited number of aid agencies. I would say that the overriding effort, though, was coming from the people who were living there. It wasn't like a concerted effort from international organizations. We obviously touched base with, there's a Dutch organization there. There were a couple of American organizations, but yeah, it was definitely more the civilians than it was anything else. And also, sorry, on your last point, I would also say that there was one kind of overriding theme also was that there was a lot of anger and frustration towards the international community that Talib there mentioned, but that everyone kind of touched on in terms of just the level of, yes, destruction that the coalition had caused, this really brutal bombing campaign, and the lack of accountability. I mean, after we left, I think it was in June this year, the Amnesty International came out with a report saying that it wasn't the limited number of deaths that the coalition said of civilian deaths that they claimed had died in this attack. It was hundreds and hundreds of them. And I don't think we'll ever know the true number of civilians who have died in Raqqa. And so there was just mounting anger and frustration towards the coalition for failing to take accountability for it and for obliterating their city.
It kind of points to the idea that ending a war doesn't necessarily mean peace, doesn't mean kind of here you go, here's your home. That it's really taken an impact on these individuals. You did, while you were there, speak to some who might be held accountable for what happened. You interviewed half of the 4-person ISIS cell, nicknamed the Beatles, and I was wondering if you could kind of talk to us about that process of interviewing them.
Yeah, it was me and my producer who were, we knew that we could get in front of them and that we had a chance to kind of pitch them on the idea of interviewing them. We knew that they were very difficult to secure and that they're sort of very picky about the interviews that they would give. So we kind of sat down with them. We were taken to this pretty nondescript building very close to the prison in which they were kept. And from what I understand, they weren't told anything about us being there either. They kind of were led up these stairs and their blindfolds were taken off them, and they're very dazed and confused as to who we were or what we were doing there. So we had almost an hour in front of them in which to pitch, please give us an interview. And they were, it was an interesting and kind of surreal experience because these guys are very charismatic and very, I mean, they have a lot of kind of childish humor between them that they were throwing back and forth, and they talked about their recollections of living in the UK and talked about what was going on in America, made some jokes about Trump, and it was sort of disorientating, and it was a very bizarre experience. And eventually they agreed to be interviewed on camera, and yeah, it was, I kind of had to step out of the room for a moment and remind myself as to who these guys are and the atrocities that they've committed. I mean, over 24 beheadings and killings allegedly on their shoulders. So it was intense.
You wrote about this experience in an article for Vice, and you kind of mentioned that what is captured on camera is one thing, and also your interaction with them off camera was another thing. I'm curious, what do you think compelled them to give the interview, and kind of what were their motivations behind what they ended up saying?
They essentially wanted to send the message that they were not getting a democratic process in their trial. And the question of what happens to them now is interesting and still hasn't been resolved. There's hundreds of ISIS fighters still kind of languishing in these SDF prisons in northern Syria, foreign fighters. And so we don't know what happens to them. I mean, the US have thrown out the ideas of sending them to Guantanamo, sending them to Iraqi prisons. No one really wants to take them, frankly. And so they're aware of that, and they're aware of their position, and they're aware of, I mean, they could either get sent to the UK, where I think that they felt like they would get a more fair trial. They could get sent to the US, where there's a chance of them getting the death penalty, which their mother has advocated strongly against recently. Or they could be tried in Syria, or they could just stay there for an indefinite period of time. So they were essentially wanted to talk about, ironically, the injustices of democracy, which they have.
It's a bit much. I don't even know what to say. I want to kind of cue up to our next clip in that, when you were in Raqqa, you met a woman named Monet, whose son Mohammed was taken by ISIS, and she's on this quest to look for her son. So actually, in your conversation with them, I believe you present a photo of Monet's son Mohammed to them and ask, do you recognize this man? What did you get from their kind of? Did you feel like they had any sense of what they had done?
They're different. I mean, they're pretty defensive, and they talked about their time in ISIS like it was a time at a water park. They sort of, talked about the good times they had, the friends they made. They sort of brushed over some of the unpleasantness by saying, of course, there's things that we regret. We all regret things. But yeah, they were not letting on as to any of the scale of atrocities that they committed. They kind of took everything very lightheartedly. I feel like they also know that the evidence that you need to really effectively prosecute those level of crimes has most likely also largely disappeared in the bombing campaign. And so they not only would not talk about those crimes, obviously, with me, but they were very aware of their position.
I want to go to this next clip because, in a way, I find it, in this context where, they're very aware of the processes that surround their fate. There are also individuals like the Syrian mother who is trying to appeal to anyone, whether it's a community person or whether it's a local official, to try and get answers about her son. And so I think we see a little bit more of kind of this situation in which people are looking towards governance to provide answers, and they're not getting them. So if we could just turn to that clip now.
سعد تعرف ليه ابني عايش ولا ميت؟
شلون أنا أساعدك على شيء مجهول؟ إنه مسجون،
إنه متعاون مع الأمريكان.
هي تهمته تعاون مع الأمريكان، ويجوز عادمينه الأمريكان، يعني لا تستبعد الشيء هذا، إذا تهمته التحالف معناته عادمينه، وإن شاء الله مو عادمينه، ولونه موجود عنا كان طالعناه، يعني بالميات المفقودين واللي يجي عم يدوروا. يعني حتى نحن العسكريين عنا أولاد مفقودين. الشعب الرقة كله رايح له داعش عادمي لهم عالم. وما بدك تراجع المجلس المدني، وأنا قلت لك التحالف الأمريكي حاضر، هو لازم يحقق بعدين نحن، هو أول شيء يحقق. وإن شاء الله يطلع عايش، بس عاد مو بكيفنا يعني.
ابني مو عمل شيء، ابني متهم.
يا حجي أنت إحنا
ابني والله مو عمل شيء.
نحن عم نحكي معك على حكيك إنه ابنك متهم، وداعش ما تخاف من الله، أنت تعرف إنه ما تخاف.
احنا ربيناهم ياخذوا الولد البلد، ربيناهم درسناهم جامعيين. أنا معلمة بهالبلد 37 سنة وأنا أعلم وأخدم بهالبلد. تعيشوا أولادنا بسلام وأمان. نحن ما نعرف وين ولادنا هلا.
بعرف يا حجي بعرف. ايش قد المسجون عندهم؟
صار له سنة.
معناته بحصار الرقة.
بفترة الحصار.
فترة الحصار. أيوة فترة الحصار هون داعش توحشت. داعش صار أوحش من أولي. كان أي واحد سجين بأي تهمة كان يجي ويعدمه فورا.
So you're saying that Monet's son is most likely dead?
أنا ما بدي أجرح، أنا قلت له ما بدي أجرحه بالكلام، بس 100%. لأنه أنا اليوم كنت بالرقة ومع مقاتل بتحرير الرقة، أعرف داعش شو يسوي. يعني مجموعة من الأهالي حاولت تنهزم وحصروهن بمنطقة، لأنه عم ينهزموا وركضوا العالم تيتخبوا من الدواعش بالبنايات، يشيلوا الأطفال والرجال والنساء ويزتوهن من البنايات. صار بس بده يذبح، هو شغلته جايته يذبح، فورا يقتله وخلص، ما في بحث ثاني. جاء إن شاء الله تلاقي ابنك وما زال قلبك جاي يقول لك إنه طيب، إن شاء الله طيب.
What was going on in your mind as you sat by this conversation?
It's actually really eerie watching it in here. It's just heartbreaking. This woman has been looking for her son at this point for the last year. I think it was a year and 5 days at the point that we met her. And she will continue looking for her son until the day she dies. It's just really, you see people in these situations on the real kind of, you learn so much about humanity because you see people in the real extremes of life. And I can't imagine anything more heartbreaking than a woman, a mother, looking for her son and likely knowing how he's died, but still just never giving up hope. You went to Raqqa in the summer. We're now several months away. I'm just curious, what has happened in Raqqa since you shot there? In terms of the level of civilian casualties. What do you know of the situation that has unraveled since you were there? I mean, I think that as far as I understand it, the cleanup effort is continuing. There is still, given the scale of destruction there, the level of rebuilding and even stabilization is not happening at the pace in which locals would want. And so the insecurity is increasing, and the levels of frustration and anger on the ground, from what I understand, is also increasing.
What do you think needs to happen in order for things to continue to head in the right direction, perhaps with a little bit more speed?
I mean, there needs to be a real international effort to stabilize, which is what the US and other Western countries committed themselves to with the destruction of Raqqa. And I mean, the argument on the ground is, it was the coalition that destroyed the city. It should be the coalition to rebuild the city. And there's obviously different arguments as to what level of rebuilding we should commit ourselves to. It's also a very, very fragile situation because Raqqa itself is kind of surrounded by different, very complex, different parties. And so we don't know what's going to happen there. And I mean, even within the last couple of days, Erdogan has sent troops to the border of northern Syria. And there's a real concern that the Turkish might lead an offensive on that area, not Raqqa itself, but on areas nearby. So it's a very, very fragile situation, and one that the US also has high stakes in, given that really the only ally on the ground is the SDF and is the Kurds there, which is currently the rebel party that is controlling Raqqa and parts of northern Syria. And so if they lose that, then it's a very, very fragile situation for the US.
Sure. We're now going to kind of transition to Yemen, but hopefully with a sense of really looking at, I want to kind of highlight the fact that Monet's search for her son, even though it's incredibly heartbreaking, and later in the episode, you see that this woman goes into these prisons literally looking at the walls for any sign, any note that might have indicated what might have happened to her son. I want to kind of look at the fact that in a way her pursuit for answers is also a testament to her resilience in the face of everything that's going on, that she still is really searching. And so it kind of points to this larger question of women in conflict, in situations of vulnerability, demonstrating resilience. And I think that's a story you capture in Yemen. So I'm just curious, going into Yemen, was that a story that you already had in mind? Did you have a sense of the kind of women that you wanted to talk to?
It was a story that came about because I was interested in the conflict there. It's now in its 4th year. It's been the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, but we actually hear quite little about women who are suffering the most in this conflict. And so, I wanted to go in there and tell their stories. And also, increasingly, what I found out is that women are, yes, some of the most vulnerable people there. I mean, 2/3 of women are now married before the age of 18. Sexual violence has increased. Domestic violence has increased on all levels. They are women are most likely to be displaced and abused. At the same time, they are incredibly resilient. And what I wanted to get across from this story is that it's often the women who are taking up roles that they wouldn't normally take up. I mean, this is one of the most conservative countries in the world for women, and I think it's been consistently ranked the worst place in the world to be a woman. And yet they're taking on these breadwinning roles. They are really stepping up, really pushing for some form of social justice and change, and actually on the front lines of some of these efforts to create peace in the country. So sorry.
Yeah, no.
So I mean, the purpose of that, in a roundabout way, is that I just wanted to show, the strength of women and how they were really just holding up society, rather than just showing them as kind of the vulnerable faces that we often see.
You met some of the women who form an elite female unit in the aid and security forces, and I'm curious if you can describe, it's also kind of comedic, kind of their interaction with the men in the security forces while they're in training, and the new recruits are kind of learning how to use their weapons. There's a lot of mansplaining that happens, which conveys across cultures. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that experience and maybe things that surprised you, things that that captured your attention in their pursuit of doing that work.
Yeah, it was refreshing because you see, it's difficult actually to interact with women sometimes, because especially when in Yemen, which is so conservative, and you can't really, it's sort of taboo to film women, for them to appear on camera, and I'm with a male cameraman, and so it's also taboo for them to be in the presence of men in certain cases. And so it's actually very, very difficult to even talk to people. And so even just moving around, you don't really see a lot of women, and they're obviously completely covered up as well. So it was actually so refreshing to see, I think, in the scene you're describing, which is some of them taking up roles in the security forces and holding these guns and taking up roles that they would never normally even consider. And the women themselves have been targeted exactly for that, and several of them have had attempts on their lives because it's seen as horrific that they would even attempt to take on jobs, let alone these sort of very male-orientated roles. So yeah, it was cool to see them being so feisty and yelling back at the men who were telling them how to hold a gun. They were like, "No, I know how to hold a gun. I'll point this gun at your head." It was kind of, in a weird way, slightly refreshing.
You also had a conversation with men who, you weren't able to, none of the senior officials in the government would agree to be interviewed, but you did have a conversation with some men who were working for the government, and you guys had a cat chewing session. And I think it was an interesting conversation because you were essentially asking them about the conditions for women, particularly at this time in Yemen, but also just overall kind of the roles between men and women and what role they had in society. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about kind of, I guess, the disparity in terms of, sense of what the problem really was between these women who are taking on these roles and these men who are kind of hanging out and chatting with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the catching thing is real in Yemen, and so actually, like, a lot of the time that we were hanging, we really wanted to get any kind of government interviews, and no one was really. Well, the first thing is that a lot of the government members aren't even in the country; they've left to go to Saudi or the UAE, and so anyone who is there is kind of lower tier. And it transpired that I was like, there must be someone doing something for this country, then we realized that these are the guys that are supposed to be running the country, and all they were doing is chewing cat. And when I asked them about, women's rights and whether that was a concern for them and the fact that abuse has increased and that so many of them are displaced, et cetera, they were like, what about men's rights? Why are you asking about women? I mean, first we need to address men's rights and then we can move to women. So yeah, it was shocking to them that was even brought up as a topic.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I also, while talking about women who have stepped into non-traditional roles and really have kind of helped to hold up society, especially, kind of in contrast to these men who are sitting around and talking to you. I wanted to highlight too that, the women who are really vulnerable and at risk at this time also include children. And so you spoke to a family, and this is where we can, I guess, talk a little bit about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, but a child who is married off by her father, essentially commoditized for the financial stability of her family. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the experience of interviewing that family, because there's also a very interesting gender dynamic there between the father of that family and the mother of that family.
Yeah, I mean, essentially this was a family who were very, very poor and had been displaced from their hometown, which was up in the north of Yemen, and had fled to southern Yemen. And one of the members got sick, and the father pulled the girl out of school and married her off to a man that he'd met, I think, once. And this girl was 12 at the time, I think. And yeah, it was just kind of escalated to be a very, very sad situation where this poor girl was kind of tied to a man who she never met and had absolutely no interest in knowing. But this is very kind of, sadly, this is the number of child marriages has increased since the war started in 2015. And finances have been so hard to come by. And so marrying your daughter off feels like for a dowry is kind of an obvious answer, unfortunately.
And it's worth highlighting that I believe the mother in the family was the one who was able to work. And I think when you asked the father, you asked her, I think, if you're the one making the money, do you get a say in the decision making?
Right.
And she says, the man sets the strategy and I execute. And so I think there's a unique moment in thinking about the decision that they made in terms of the marriage of the daughter. But I think when you ask the mother, she says if it were up to her, she wouldn't have done it. And I'm just curious, I'm more so kind of trying to think about the dynamic in the family that you witnessed, because the daughter also has very much resents her father.
Yeah, how can you not when your father sells you off for $200 to a man 3 times your age? And yeah, it is funny. I mean, yeah, the woman was the one who, even in these like very desperate situations, was going out and collecting cans and taking them, like hauling these huge cans around to try and sell them for money so that she could try and get her daughter back into school, actually, which is what she was trying to do, and to also try and buy her daughter back and out of this marriage that she'd been trapped in. But yeah, it's just, I mean, it's cultural as well in some ways, in that, yeah, it's just kind of accepted that he's the man of the household, and even though he doesn't work or wasn't particularly contributing to the family, that he was, whatever he said goes.
Well, I want to cut to this clip of some women who are embodying a different kind of voice, and we'll talk a little bit about that clip.
Some Yemeni women are taking things into their own hands. In Aden, we came across a street protest demanding the end to illegal detentions by Yemeni security forces. The protesters call themselves the Mothers of Abductees and were calling for justice.
دولة ونريد عدالة وقانون وحق ونعم مع إنسانية مع دولة مدنية حق ودولة نظام وقانون.
It's really quite extraordinary to see women out here in public shouting themselves hoarse right outside the security building, which is incredibly risky here, and ensuring that their voices are heard and that men are the ones listening to them in a place where often their voices go completely unheard.
يعني نحن مش عارفين نحن اليوم نروح أو مش نروح. يعني إيش مصيرنا نحن الآن من هذه الوقفات؟ يعني نحن يمكن نهاجر، يمكن نهتك، يمكن نظلم، يمكن نسجن، يمكن نتعذب، يمكن يحصل لنا أي شيء. فيها جميع أبناء الشعب الحرية والمساواة والعدالة.
Some of the government security men are coming over right now to tell these women that they shouldn't be here, and these women are being incredibly feisty, telling them that they have every right to be here and that this is their protest and their fight to fight. You're making quite an impact.
أكيد نحن مؤثرين على الشارع لأن نحن بصفاتنا قياديات جنوبية.
That impact has been lasting. A few weeks ago, 46 detainees were released from a Yemeni prison following the Mothers' protests. Despite being the most vulnerable and overlooked half of society, women here are proving themselves capable of pushing for real change. It's only with their involvement that Yemen will ever have hope of one day finding peace. How much do you think the future of this country depends on the actions of Yemeni women right now?
نحن الحق، نحن بشر، نحن ناس، نريد حقوقنا، نريد تحسين معيشتنا، نريد نضمن مستقبل أولادنا.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how this protest came about and kind of what, the ramifications on the women who participated, but also kind of whether this is an ongoing practice for them in their society, and do you see that role increasing?
Yeah, so actually this is a movement, the Mother of Abductees, which exists both in the north and in the south. And it originated from literally the mothers of people who'd been detained as largely political prisoners, and others. And yeah, they're fighting to have them released. And yeah, a lot of them spoke of ramifications because, I mean, giving, there is sort of this expectation that you sort of stay silent and just fit into the gender norms within society there. And so raising your voice and doing it in such a bold manner and criticizing in this case, in the south, it's the Emiratis who are controlling the prisons that they want these political prisoners to be released from, is a very brash move. And it goes against all kind of gender expectations within the country. And so, yeah, we were hanging out with these ladies as they were preparing to really push to get some of them released. And they were very, very persistent. I mean, I have to say, they were there every single day outside these prisons. There's allegedly horrific human rights abuses going on inside these prisons, which is, why it's so crucial for them to get these people out. A lot of them also were not even related to the prisoners who'd been abducted. So they were, they just saw it as their duty. They were like, we're not on the front lines fighting, but we can try and push for equality. We can try and push for human rights, and we can try and better our countries in whatever ways we can.
Do you think the women in Yemen have a sense of community with each other, or is that traditionally have, or has that been a recent development in terms of needing to lean on each other for support in this situation?
I mean, I got the sense that there's a real sense of community, and that I would say that given what's happened to their country in the last few years, you can't really ignore that. And so I can only imagine, and I hadn't been before this year, but I can only imagine that those bonds increased, and that sense of community got stronger, and that women are increasingly kind of grouping together and finding their strengths and trying to figure out how they can uphold society.
And lastly, just thinking about the increased attention on this conflict, and the fact that now there's a strong international desire for a ceasefire, and we saw a internationally backed ceasefire go into play on Tuesday in Hodeidah. And I'm just curious, with things like that kind of proceeding, are you optimistic about the future of Yemen? Are there things that you feel like policymakers need to keep in mind as that moves forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think like for the first time, there is some real level of optimism and hope. And for such a long time, there's just been pure bleakness when it comes to the topic of Yemen. But given what's happened in the international community, given the case of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi being killed by the Saudis, and given that this country is on the brink of a mass famine, I mean, I think that the latest figures are 16 million people could potentially face famine if something is not done, then there has been a real effort and to attempt to do something about the situation in Yemen. So yeah, there is this very fragile ceasefire at the moment. I think it's pretty crucial that holds, and that is actually really implemented on the ground, and that the UN stays strong to their word there, and that it just seems incredibly fragile because there are so many different groups who also need to stay committed to that ceasefire in order for it to stick. And I think that it kind of could go either way, because if it sticks, then that's incredible, some form of glimmer of hope for the country, which it so desperately needs. On the other hand, if it doesn't, I mean, the ceasefire is in Hodeidah, which is the main port city where kind of 70% of the goods come into the country. And if it collapses, it sounds like the fighting could be even worse than it was before. And I mean, these ceasefires have collapsed before when they've attempted to negotiate them. I think the last one was in 2016. That collapse, there's been several of these, and none of them have sadly worked out. So like any Yemen experts you speak to will be very, very cautious about predicting that this is going to be a lasting effort, and we're only kind of one day into this so far.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, I mean, yeah, the level of famine that would break out from that, the level of all-out destruction across the country would be pretty horrific.
We're going to go to audience questions in just 1 minute, but I wanted to ask you, you've been reporting in this region for some time now, and I think in a previous interview you had said you were fascinated by what happens to humanity in the most extreme circumstances. How has this reporting impacted you, impacted your role as a journalist?
I mean, I think that on a personal level, I mean, I think that it's interesting because I think on the one hand, you kind of become somewhat hardened to seeing this sort of destruction and this sort of suffering. And on the other hand, you realize as time goes on that it really does affect you. And I think I've actually only started to realize that recently. But yeah, it's impossible for people's stories not to stick with you. It does really, I think that it really, at least for a moment, really kind of recalibrates things and makes you think about what's important. I mean, for example, when we're in Raqqa, we were hanging out with Monet, the lady who was looking for her son and had been looking for her son for the last year. And we visited her son's home, which has been completely destroyed by mortars. And we were just sort of standing there, walked over a bunch of dead bodies to get there, and was standing there on top of this pile of rubble. And I was like, I mean, even if you find your son, he's going to come back to absolutely nothing. There's nothing left here. And she was like, it doesn't matter. Like, all I need is my son, because all we have left in the world is these human connections. That's all that matters, which like really, really puts things into perspective. And I think that, yeah, that's kind of grounding in a lot of ways. And I feel very privileged to get to experience that.
Now to go to the audience for some questions. If you have one, if you could please raise your hand and we will bring a mic to you. Over on the left here.
Hey, Isobel, big fan. I've noticed in a lot of your interviews, you seem to strike this balance between being disagreeable and agreeable by
That's just my general demeanor.
Yeah, I don't know how you do it, but you sort of confront and challenge the other person while making the environment conducive to sort of an ongoing productive conversation. I wonder like how you maintain that composure, especially when you're interviewing people like ISIS fighters or hypocritical sheikhs sending, radicalizing other people's sons to go fight in war, and just sort of how do you strike that balance before an interview?
Well, thank you. I think that it just comes from a place of really, really wanting to understand and really wanting to listen, and really, I don't think there's any point going in there guns blazing and super aggressive with a line of questioning. I mean, it is about striking that balance. You need to hold people accountable for their actions, and you need to question when they, for example, these ISIS fighters kind of want to brush over facts and brush over events that really took place, and to talk about their level of responsibility within that. But it also, I mean, the reason I enjoy doing this reporting is because I really hope to further our understanding of humanity. And I really want to, I mean, there's no such thing as a black and white story. There's always two sides to it. And I want to understand why these guys went to Syria. I want to understand what they were doing there. I want to understand how they feel about it now. I want to understand if they have any regrets. And all humans, I think, deserve a chance to have those conversations. And my role is just to have that conversation.
Right here. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So I actually work in news as well. I'm a podcast coordinator. I'm not on air at all. But I was wondering, how do you pick a story and run with it full throttle? Like, there are so many important stories in the world. How do you pick the stories that you do?
It's a constant toss and pull. I mean, I constantly struggle with what stories I should be doing. And I guess it's increasingly, I'm sure you have this as well, it's so difficult given that in our current climate, it makes me anxious. I feel like I should be covering everything, and then I'm like, oh, I'm not covering anything, and then what am I doing? I feel like it just has to come from a place of what you're interested in and what feels the most important. And also, I mean, these stories are a good example of, I felt like they were not being covered effectively, and I just didn't understand what was going on there. And so it also comes from a place of like really just trying to get to the bottom of what was happening.
Time for one more question, or two more questions right there. We'll come to you next.
Hi, as an audience in the US, what do you think we should know in order to fully decipher the situations in the Middle East?
Wow.
Next program
straight
topic.
in there. I mean, more than anything, that it's just incredibly complex. I think that the US's relationship with the Middle East has, I mean, it's so hard to summarize. It's been a really lengthy one, and I think that we're going to continue having a very complex relationship with the Middle East, and I think that it's good for us to kind of be aware of the different players there, and also that we have currently a very, very fragile situation because there are so many. The Middle East is kind of where the global stage meets, and there's so many kind of fractious relationships, and I'm not describing one thing at all well, so I don't really know the answer to that, I'm sorry.
The motivations are fairly complex, and I would also use this as a selfish moment to encourage you to come to programs here at the 9/11 Museum, where we really dive into all of those subjects one at a time, really, and we're still going today. Yeah. One more question right up here, this gentleman.
Sorry.
So you describe these places as those where women are really repressed, and yet you as a woman seem to get access. Tell us how you do that. What's the your advantage to get you into these places where women aren't usually accepted?
Well, I mean, I think reporting in the Middle East as a Western woman, you kind of walk into this no man's land type territory where you're not really considered a man, but you're also not really considered a woman. And that kind of gives you the opportunity to, you are underestimated in a lot of situations. So that gives me the opportunity to sit in front of certain people, and they don't expect you to ask the hard questions, which is a bonus because they wouldn't necessarily let a man in that situation. It also affords me the opportunity to kind of float between worlds and to really spend time with the women and with children. And I feel like that's kind of a very privileged situation to be able to see both sides.
Well, I want to thank Isobel for her really difficult but really important reporting that she's done. I want to encourage everyone, if you don't already have an HBO subscription, After the Fall, Syria, After ISIS, and all of Isobel's work is available to watch on HBO Go and HBO Now. We are also, this is our final public program here at the museum for this season. We will pick up back next year and also later in the year, but I promise the programs will be really exciting. So look out for an announcement from us in late January. So with that being said, I want to really thank Vice for their collaboration with us on the programming front. And if you could join me in thanking Isobel for our time today. Thank you.